end, and that the EU stands for TTIP, corporate empowerment and the trampling of Greek democracy. Is she wrong?
I do think she's wrong on this, and
really,
I think
you support TTIP, do you? The Transatlantic Investment Partnership?
Well, let me explain the position on TTIP. No, I don't. I absolutely oppose TTIP, but I think you have to make a distinction between the right-wing governments that currently inhabit most of the seats around the council table and the European institutions. Right now, one of the biggest cheerleaders for TTIP is David Cameron. Anybody who thinks that by withdrawing from the EU, we're suddenly going to have a nice, cuddly trade policy, I think is living in fantasyland. That won't happen. Essentially, David Cameron will put exactly the same principles of TTIP into a whole set of bilateral trade agreements he would like to see. So the best way of fighting TTIP is to work with, for example, our colleagues in Germany, 250,000 of whom were out on the streets of Berlin very recently, mobilising against TTIP. It's by lobbying our members of the European Parliament who have the powers to stop TTIP. It's by looking at the fact that 3.8 million people have signed a petition across Europe against TTIP. I think we're going to have a much better chance of defeating that kind of trade policy by doing so in Europe and recognising, as I say, that if you put right-wing policies into Europe, you get right-wing policies out. I think we need to make a distinction between the right-wing governments currently around the table and the importance of working at an EU level and the European institutions as they stand.
So you're supporting staying in the EU because you don't like the policies of David Cameron and the policies of this country, which seems... But that's the sort of logic of your argument, in a sense. I mean, if Jenny Jones is indulging in fantasy politics in that sense, isn't she right about the contradiction, though, between Green opposition to TTIP and yet its continued support for the EU? You won't be able to counter what is going on in the EU at the moment by staying in it.
I object to all sorts of things that the current government is doing here in the UK. Am I suggesting we turn our back on British democracy, on governance? Of course not. I'm a Democrat. I will fight that in the European Union just as I'll fight it in the national government. The question about the referendum is, do we think that we are going to be safer, greener, fairer, stronger if we stay in the EU or if we come away? And I think all of the evidence suggests that we'll have a better chance of having a better outcome for our kids and their kids if we stay inside the EU rather than if we think that we're going to be able to fight those battles best by being on our own.
Right, although the party's policies are against so many things within the EU. Institutions are undemocratic, you're not happy with the single market, the direction of the union. You sort of think, well, what is there left to support?
I'll tell you what there's left to support. If you're looking at the environment as one example, it is beyond conception that we would be better off trying to deal with issues like climate change working as an individual country. The reason that the outcome at the Paris climate talks in December was so much better than so many of us feared was precisely because the EU was working as a bloc. It had so much more leverage as a result, and it was able to ensure that some of the newer countries in the EU had much more ambitious targets too.
And that is a positive campaign being put forward by the Greens, and that is the difference, perhaps, as Caroline Lucas would see it, between the Green campaign and some of the other Remain campaigns, that working together you'll get bigger and better results.
Look, I've always respected Caroline's position, that she looks at the environment and the green energy issues about it as something that's very important to her.
And works better by staying in the EU.
And she takes the view that it works better within the
Does
EU
it not?
because, as she says, you need to work together with people and other countries and other organisations. But I take an opposite view to that because I come to this argument with one of democracy. I don't believe that the European Union is a democratic organisation. I think it's anti-democratic. It's shown that in its history, the way that it treated Ireland and also Holland and in terms of France, and the way that it treats Greece in terms of its austerity. Its very structure and the nature in which the Commission controls everything, creates everything working in secret organisations means that it is an anti-democratic organisation. It is, as Aldous Huxley put in his book, Brave New World. That is the organisation of those who are bureaucrats, not